If you are enjoying this video, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. Share it with your friends, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Every like and subscribe helps the channel grow. My name is James Cooper, but everyone calls me Jim. I've been a park ranger at Mammoth Cave for almost 10 years now, but my story with caves goes back much further. You see, before I wore this ranger uniform, I was a coal miner, working deep underground with my younger brother Tommy. That was until the day everything went wrong. I still remember that day, the rumble of the earth, the crash of falling rocks, and the darkness that swallowed everything. Tommy didn't make it out. All I have left of him is this old brass compass he always carried for good luck. Some luck, right? But I keep it with me anyway, along with a silver flask that helps me forget on the bad nights. After the mining accident, I couldn't stay away from caves. Sounds crazy, I know, but something about them called to me. Maybe it was my way of staying close to Tommy, or maybe I just needed to face my fears. So I learned everything there was to know about caves, how to read them, how to move through them, how to listen to their secrets. Now, after 20 years of crawling through these underground mazes, I can find my way around in pitch darkness just by feeling the air moving across my skin and listening to the echoes of my footsteps. These days, I spend most of my time in Mammoth Cave. It's the longest cave system in the world, with endless tunnels that twist and turn beneath Kentucky. Some parts of it haven't been explored yet, dark places where no human has ever set foot. At least, that's what we thought. 3 days ago, a group of cavers went missing. Young folks, experienced ones too. They were supposed to be mapping a new passage they'd found, but they never came back out. Now I am leading the rescue mission to find them, and something about this whole situation feels wrong. The cave feels different today, colder than usual, and the darkness seems thicker somehow. I should have listened to that feeling in my gut. Should have paid more attention to the way my brother's compass started acting strange, spinning like crazy when we got near certain tunnels. But I didn't. And now? Well, now I know why these caves have so many stories about them. Why the old Native American drawings on the walls show those strange, long-limbed creatures. Why some passages have remained unexplored all these years. This is my story. A story about what I found in the darkness below. And if you are reading this, it means, well, let's just say I hope someone finds this warning in time. Because down here in the dark, something is watching. Something is hunting. And it knows how to wait. The rescue mission started like any other. I packed my usual gear, flashlights, extra batteries, first aid kit, water, and some protein bars. The missing cavers had gone in through the tourist entrance, but ventured way beyond where regular visitors are allowed. Their last radio message mentioned finding a narrow crack in the wall that wasn't on any of our maps. "Cooper, you copy?" My radio crackled with Ben's voice. "He's my backup, waiting at the main entrance." "Any signs of them yet?" "Nothing yet," I replied, shining my light across the limestone walls. But I found their first marker, a red ribbon tied to a rock formation. They came this way all right. The air felt different as I went deeper. Usually, Mammoth Cave stays at a steady 54 degrees, like a natural refrigerator. But today, some passages felt ice cold, while others were surprisingly warm. My flashlight beam caught something odd on the wall. 3 long scratches that seemed to give off a faint glow. I've seen plenty of marks in caves before, but nothing like this. Then I found their camp. It was just wrong. The sleeping bags were still rolled up, never used. Their backpacks were placed in a neat circle, like they'd stopped for a break. A half-eaten energy bar sat on top of a map. 3 water bottles, all still full. 3 helmets with headlamps, perfectly lined up. But no people. As I examined the scene, my radio started picking up weird sounds. Through the static, I could hear bits of old conversations, tour guides from months ago, cavers from previous expeditions, even my own voice from past rescue missions. But that's impossible. Radio signals don't work this deep underground. I pulled out Tommy's compass, a habit I have when something feels off. The needle was spinning wildly. around and around, like it was searching for something. In all my years underground, I'd never seen it do that. That's when I heard it, a voice calling from deeper in the cave. It sounded exactly like Sarah Williams, one of the missing cavers. "Help! Is anyone there? Please help!" I grabbed my gear and started moving toward the voice. But with each step, a feeling of dread grew stronger in my gut. Because I remembered something about Sarah Williams from the missing persons report, she was deaf in her right ear and spoke with a slight stutter. This voice had neither. I switched off my main light and crouched in the darkness. Years of cave exploration had taught me one thing. When something feels wrong, it usually is. I pulled out my backup flashlight, a small one that gave off just enough light to see a few feet ahead. "Ben, do you copy?" I whispered into my radio. All I got back was static and those weird echoes of old conversations. The voice called again, this time from a different direction. "Please help us. We're trapped." Now it sounded like Mike Chen, another one of the missing cavers. But something was off about his voice too. It was too perfect, like a recording being played back. I moved forward slowly, touching the cave walls to guide me. The stone felt different under my fingers, slick with something that made my skin tingle. When I pulled my hand back and checked it with my small light, I saw a faint greenish glow on my fingertips. Some kind of strange, glowing slime covered the walls. That's when I saw the cave paintings. They were old, really old. The kind of paintings Native Americans made thousands of years ago. But these weren't the usual pictures of buffalo or hunters that you sometimes find in caves. These showed something else. Tall, skinny creatures with too many joints in their arms and legs. They seemed to be climbing the walls, hunting people. And above them, there was a warning written in more recent paint. "Turn back, they dwell below." My heart was pounding now, but I kept going. Those three people needed help, even if everything in my body was screaming at me to run. I followed the glowing slime trail deeper into the cave, into passages that weren't on any of our maps. The tunnel opened into a big chamber, and my light caught something that made my blood run cold. Gear from other cavers, old backpacks, helmets, cameras, but not just from our missing group. Some of this stuff looked decades old, and scattered among the gear were bones. Lots of bones. Then my flashlight died. In the pitch blackness, I heard something move. Not like a bat or a cave cricket. This was bigger, and it was moving across the ceiling. I could hear the soft scraping of what sounded like claws on stone. And then, in perfect copy of my own voice, it spoke. "Welcome home, Jim Cooper." I froze. Every survival instinct I had learned over 20 years of caving kicked in. Without my light, I had to rely on my other senses. The airflow told me there were 3 passages leading out of this chamber. The temperature had dropped so low I could see my breath when I pulled out my lighter for a quick look around. That's when I saw it, just for a second in the lighter's small flame. A pale white shape, bigger than a person, crawling along the wall. Its skin looked almost see-through, like a cavefish, arms and legs bent in ways they shouldn't. And then my lighter went out. I ran, not blindly. You never run blindly in a cave. I used the air currents like I'd trained myself to, following the flow that felt strongest. Behind me, I could hear it moving, getting closer. The scraping sounds came from all directions now, like it was all around me. "Jim, remember how Tommy died?" It called out, using my brother's voice this time. "Trapped in the dark, just like you are now." My foot caught on something, and I stumbled, falling hard onto the rocky ground. The thing laughed, a horrible sound that mixed all the voices it had copied. I rolled into a small crack in the wall, making myself as small as possible. That's when Tommy's compass started to glow. The brass compass in my pocket was giving off a soft blue light, just enough to see by. And in that light, I saw more glowing marks on the walls, not the creature's slime this time, but old carvings. They showed a map of some kind, with a chamber marked by a warning symbol. The creature hissed and backed away from the compass's light. That's when I understood. This thing had evolved in the deepest dark. Any light hurt it, but natural light hurt it most. And somehow, my brother's old compass was special. I heard rocks falling behind me. The thing was blocking my way back. My radio crackled again, and through the static, I heard Ben's voice, real this time. "Jim!" The old mining tunnels collapse. Chemical light, stored there. Of course, the mining equipment cache. Years ago, before this became a national park, miners had stored equipment in some of the lower tunnels, including emergency flares and chemical lights. If I could find that cache. But first, I had to get past the creature blocking my path. And from the sounds all around me, I was pretty sure it wasn't alone anymore. Something moved in the darkness ahead. Then another thing to my left. And another. The compass glowed brighter, showing me what I didn't want to see. I was surrounded by pale, twisted shapes. And they were closing in. I had one chance. Just one. I grabbed my silver flask, unscrewed the cap, and pulled out my lighter. The creatures were getting closer, their long fingers reaching for me. I could smell their breath, like old rotten things. "Hey!" I shouted. "Remember my brother Tommy? He was a miner, and miners know one thing really well." I poured the whiskey from my flask onto the ground in front of me. "We know how to make fire." I flicked the lighter and dropped it. The whiskey caught immediately, creating a wall of flames. The creatures screamed, a horrible sound that echoed through the caves and backed away from the fire. I ran past them, following the old mining symbols I could now see carved into the walls. The compass kept glowing, getting brighter whenever the creatures got close. It was like Tommy was still helping me, even now. I could hear them following, but they stayed back from the compass's light. After what felt like hours of running and climbing, I found it. The old mining storage room. The door was rusty but still solid. Inside, boxes of equipment were covered in decades of dust. My hands shook as I searched through them, throwing aside old ropes and broken tools. Then I found what I needed, a box of emergency flares and chemical lights. But as I reached for it, I heard something that made my heart stop. Behind me, in the darkness, someone was crying, "Please, help me." I turned around slowly, holding up the compass. Its light showed me Sarah Williams. The real Sarah Williams this time. She was huddled in a corner, shivering. One of her legs was badly hurt. "Sarah, is it really you?" I asked, moving closer with the compass raised. She looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "Mr. Cooper, you came for us?" Then her face changed to pure fear as she looked behind me. "Look out!" I spun around just in time to see the biggest creature yet dropping from the ceiling. It was the size of a car, its pale skin almost transparent. I could see its organs through its skin. This wasn't just another cave crawler. This was their mother, and she was protecting her nest. The mining room, I realized with horror, wasn't just a storage space. The walls were covered with leathery eggs, each one gently pulsing with a faint light. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. And we were standing right in the middle of their nursery. "Sarah," I whispered, "can you walk?" She shook her head. "My leg's broken. The others, they didn't make it, Mr. Cooper. These things, they took them." The mother creature moved closer, her long limbs clicking against the stone floor. Behind her, more of the smaller ones appeared in the doorway. We were trapped. That's when I noticed something else in the mining supplies. A box of old dynamite. It was dangerous. Old dynamite can explode if you just look at it wrong. But I also knew it was our only chance. "Sarah, listen carefully," I said, handing her my brother's compass. "This light keeps them away. Hold it up and don't let it go, no matter what." I grabbed the box of flares with one hand and reached slowly for the dynamite with the other. The mother creature watched me, her head tilting like a curious dog. She could probably smell the old explosives. Maybe she even remembered their smell from the mining days. "You've been down here a long time, haven't you?" I said to her. "Sleeping, waiting, protecting your babies? Well, I am sorry, but I can't let you hurt any more people." She lunged at me right as I lit the first flare. The bright red light filled the room and all the creatures shrieked and backed away. I used that moment to grab Sarah, pulling her arm over my shoulder. "Close your eyes," I yelled, throwing more flares into the room. In the bright light, I could see hundreds of eggs on the walls, all of them starting to hatch. We had to end this now. I pulled out the oldest stick of dynamite and my last flare. The mother creature was recovering from the light, getting ready to attack again. I looked at Sarah. When I say run, you run. Follow the mining symbols on the walls. They'll lead you out. What about you? I handed her my radio. I'll be right behind you. That was a lie, and I think she knew it. But she nodded anyway. Run, I shouted, lighting every flare I had left. Sarah stumbled away as fast as she could, holding the compass out in front of her. The smaller creatures backed away from its light, letting her pass. It was just me and the mother now. I held up the dynamite. You want to know what happened to my brother Tommy? He died saving people, and that's not a bad way to go. I lit the dynamite with a flare and threw it right at the biggest cluster of eggs. Then I ran, but not toward the exit. I ran deeper into the cave. The mother creature screamed and chased me, just like I hoped she would. The explosion was bigger than I expected. The whole tunnel started to cave in. Rocks fell everywhere. I felt something sharp hit my head, and everything went dark. I woke up in total darkness. I couldn't move. Rocks were piled all around me. The air was getting thin, but I could hear the creatures shrieking as they died, buried under tons of rock. And I smiled, knowing Sarah was safe. I pulled out my radio, hoping it still worked. By some miracle, it did. I pressed the button and spoke my last words. This is Park Ranger James Cooper. If anyone finds this message, stay out of the deep caves. Some things should stay buried. And Tommy, I am coming home, little brother. They never found my body. Sarah made it out and told them everything, but they didn't believe her story about the creatures. They sealed off that section of Mammoth Cave, saying it was structurally unsafe. But sometimes, on quiet nights, visitors say they can still hear voices in the cave. Their own voices played back to them from the darkness. And if you bring a radio down there, you might catch my final message, still bouncing around those ancient tunnels. Just remember, if you are ever deep in a cave and you hear a familiar voice calling for help, ask yourself, is that voice too perfect? Because down in the darkness, not everything that sounds human is human, and not all monsters are make-believe. My name is Bill Henderson, and I am a park ranger at White Mountain National Forest in New Hampshire. I've been here for 5 years now, living alone in my ranger station. Just me and my dog Scout. Well, that's not completely true. I used to have my wife Sarah with me, but cancer took her 2 years ago. These days I find peace in the quiet of the forest. Most days, anyway. I guess I should tell you what happened last winter. The winter that changed everything. The winter that made me quit my job and move to a place where I never have to see snow again. It started in December 1977, the coldest winter I'd ever seen, and I've seen plenty. The kind of cold that freezes your breath before it leaves your mouth. The weather folks on the radio kept talking about how weird it was, how the temperature dropped lower than it should, but that wasn't the strangest thing. It was the silence. You see, forests are never really quiet. Tea here is always something. Birds calling, branches creaking, wind whistling. But that winter, it was different. It was like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. I first noticed something was wrong during my morning patrol. Scout, my German shepherd, was acting weird. Usually, he loves running through the snow. But that morning, he just sat in the truck, whining. I had to drag him out to check on a report about some dead deer someone found. I wish I'd listened to Scout that day. What I found wasn't just a dead deer. It was. Well, I've seen some awful things in Vietnam, but this was different. The deer looked like it had exploded from the inside out. Its ribs were pointing the wrong way, like something had burst out of it. There was hardly any blood, which was strange because in the snow, you can usually see every drop clear as day. I took pictures for the wildlife report. We have to document anything unusual. But when I got back to develop them in my little darkroom, yeah, I still use the old camera. can't trust those new electronic ones in the cold. The film was completely frozen. Frozen solid, even though it had been in my warm jacket pocket the whole time. That evening, my radio started picking up weird noises. Not static, I know what static sounds like. This was different, like whispers, but not in any language I knew. And I know a few, thanks to my time in the army. The sound made Scout hide under my desk, ears flat against his head. Later that night, I saw the lights. Everyone knows about the northern lights, right? They're supposed to be beautiful, green and blue dancing in the sky. But these were red, blood red. And they shouldn't have been there at all. We're too far south to see the northern lights. I called the weather station in town, but the line was dead. Not unusual during winter storms, but there wasn't a storm. The sky was clear as glass, except for those red lights. I wrote everything in my logbook, just like I always do. Looking back at that first entry now, I can see how clueless I was, how I tried to explain everything with logic and reason. Weather patterns, animal behavior, scientific stuff. But science can't explain what happened next. Science can't explain the tracks I found the next morning, human footprints in the snow that started in the middle of nowhere and disappeared just as suddenly, or why the temperature dropped 30 degrees in just one small area of the forest while staying normal everywhere else. And science definitely can't explain the screams I started hearing at night, screams that sounded almost human but not quite. I should have known then that this wasn't going to be a normal winter. Maybe if I had, things would have turned out differently. But I was still trying to be the rational ex-soldier, the reliable park ranger, still trying to make sense of things that didn't make any sense. I didn't know it then, but that was just the beginning. The beginning of the worst winter of my life. The winter that taught me that some legends aren't just stories. Some monsters are real, and they were coming for all of us. The next few days were quiet, too quiet. Even the wind seemed afraid to blow through the trees. Scout stayed close to me, always looking over his shoulder like he was watching for something. I got a call on my radio about some hikers who hadn't come back from their camping trip. 3 of them, college kids who wanted to take pictures of the winter forest. Their families were worried because they always checked in every evening, but nobody had heard from them for 2 days. I didn't want to go into the forest. Something in my gut, the same feeling I used to get in Vietnam before an ambush, told me to stay in my cabin. But that's not what rangers do. We help people. That's our job. So Scout and I headed out in my truck, following the trail the hikers were supposed to take. The snow was deep, but that wasn't what bothered me. It was the way it fell. You see, snow usually falls everywhere pretty much the same way. But here, some spots had no snow at all, while right next to them, the drifts were taller than my truck. It just wasn't natural. We found their first campsite around noon. The tent was still there, but something was wrong. The sleeping bags were scattered around like someone had thrown them. Their backpacks were torn open, food spilled everywhere. But there was no sign of bears or wolves, no paw prints, no claw marks. Just those same strange footprints I'd seen before, appearing and disappearing like whatever made them could walk on air. That's when my radio started acting up again. Through the static, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It sounded like someone singing, but the voice was all wrong, like ice cracking on a frozen lake. Scout started growling, his fur standing straight up. I took out my old Winchester rifle, the special one with silver-tipped bullets. Some might laugh at silver bullets, but my grandfather taught me that some things in this world don't care about regular ammunition. I used to think he was just telling stories. Now, I wasn't so sure. The sun was starting to set, and in these mountains, darkness comes fast. I should have headed back. Every bit of training I had told me not to stay out after dark. But I had to check one more thing. There was a trail of those strange footprints leading away from the camp. They went deeper into the forest, toward an area where the trees were older than America itself. Some of those trees had weird carvings on them, symbols that looked like warnings. I took one last photo of the campsite and turned to leave. That's when Scout froze. His ears went up, and he stared into the darkness between the trees. I followed his gaze and saw something that shouldn't be possible. About 100 yards away, the snow was moving upward, not falling, rising, like gravity had turned backwards in that one spot. And in the middle of this impossible snow shower, I saw a shadow. It was tall, much taller than any person should be, and it was watching us. I raised my rifle, but by the time I looked through the scope, both the shadow and the strange snow were gone. Only then did I notice how cold it had gotten. The temperature had dropped so fast that the water in my canteen had turned to solid ice. We drove back to the station fast but careful. The whole way, I kept checking my mirrors. Not because I thought something was following us, I knew something was following us. I just couldn't see it, but I could feel its eyes on me like an icy hand on the back of my neck. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind was howling outside my cabin, but it didn't sound like wind anymore. It sounded like voices, hungry voices. And somehow, I knew that tomorrow would be worse. Much worse. Morning came with a storm. Not a normal winter storm with steady snow and wind. This one was different. The clouds were swirling in circles right above the section of forest where I'd seen the shadow. I've seen lots of storms in my years as a ranger, but never one that stayed in just one spot like that. I made some hot coffee and tried to think straight. Those hikers were still out there somewhere. Maybe they were alive, hiding from whatever I saw yesterday. I had to go back out. That's when Scout started barking at the window. I walked over, expecting to see some deer, or maybe a moose. Instead, I saw footprints in the snow. They started at the edge of the forest and came right up to my cabin, stopping at my front door. But there were no footprints going back. My hand shook as I checked my rifle. I counted my silver bullets, 12 left. Outside, the storm was getting worse, but only in that one part of the forest. The rest of the sky was clear blue. Scout whined when I grabbed his leash. He didn't want to go out there. Smart dog. But I couldn't leave those hikers out there alone. So we got in my truck and drove toward the storm. About a mile from where I'd seen the shadow yesterday, my truck's engine just died. It wasn't out of gas. It just stopped, like something had frozen it solid. The temperature gauge showed it was 40 degrees below zero. That's when I heard it, someone calling for help. Through the swirling snow, I saw a person stumbling toward us. It was one of the hikers, a young woman in a torn blue jacket. But something was wrong. The way she walked wasn't right, like her legs were too long and bent in the wrong places. "Are you okay?" I called out. "I am here to help." She looked up at me, and my heart nearly stopped. Her eyes were completely white, like they were frozen solid. Her skin was pale blue, like someone who'd been out in the cold too long. "So hungry," she whispered, but her voice sounded wrong, like breaking ice. "We're all so hungry now." Scout started growling, pulling hard on his leash. I took a step back, keeping my rifle ready. The girl, or whatever she was now, took another stumbling step toward us. That's when I saw it, the thing from yesterday, standing right behind her. It was even taller than I remembered, maybe 15 feet high. Its skin was gray like old ice, stretched tight over a body that was impossibly thin. And its eyes, they glowed red like those strange northern lights. The girl screamed, not a human scream, but something that sounded like a frozen lake cracking apart. She ran at me faster than anything should be able to move. I fired my rifle. The silver bullet hit her shoulder, and she fell back into the snow. But she got right back up, her wound smoking like dry ice. Then the tall creature, I knew now it had to be a Wendigo, reached down and grabbed her. What happened next? I don't want to describe it. When it was done, the girl was gone, and the Wendigo was even bigger than before. It turned those glowing red eyes on me, and suddenly I couldn't move. My whole body felt frozen. Scout was tugging at my jacket, trying to make me run, but I was stuck there, staring into those terrible eyes. The Wendigo opened its mouth, showing teeth like icicles, and I smelled something like rotten meat and winter air. That's when Scout did something both very brave and very crazy. He broke free from his leash and ran straight at the Wendigo, barking and snapping. It was enough to break whatever spell had frozen me in place. I fired 3 quick shots at the Wendigo's chest. It screamed, a sound like breaking ice, and disappeared into the storm. Scout and I ran back to the truck. Behind us, I heard more screams. Not just one Wendigo, but many. They were calling to each other, hunting us. By some miracle, the truck started. As we drove away, I saw shapes moving through the trees in my mirror. Tall, thin shapes following us. They weren't trying to catch us, not yet. They were just letting us know that they could. My arm was stinging. Somewhere in all that chaos, I'd gotten cut. It was just a small cut, but it felt like it was full of ice. As I drove back to the station, I couldn't stop thinking about how hungry I felt. So terribly, terribly hungry. Back at my cabin, I tried to radio for help, but all I got was that weird singing again, like ice cracking in a frozen lake. My hands were shaking as I cleaned the cut on my arm. The wound had turned a pale blue color, like frostbite, but it felt like it was burning. And the hunger, it was getting worse. I ate everything I could find in my cupboards: canned soup, beef jerky, crackers, even Scout's dog food. But nothing helped. My stomach felt like an empty hole that would never be full. Scout watched me from the corner, growling softly. He knew something was wrong with me. Smart dog. I locked him in the bedroom. If I turned into one of those things, I didn't want him to be the first thing I found. I needed help, real help. In the station's old files, I found reports going back 100 years. Every few decades, the same thing would happen. People would go missing. Strange storms would appear, and there would be stories about tall, hungry creatures in the snow. Then I found something important. A letter from 1932. It was from a Native American elder named John Whitebear to the head ranger. He wrote about the Wendigos, how they were once human, but their hunger for human flesh turned them into monsters. The more they ate, the bigger and stronger they got. And anyone they bit or scratched would slowly turn into one of them. But there was hope. The letter talked about a way to stop someone from turning into a Wendigo. There was a special ceremony, but it needed 3 things. 1. Sacred herbs that grew in summer, which I didn't have. 2. Blessed silver. I had my bullets. 3. Something called spirit stones from the old tribal grounds. I remembered those strange rock formations I'd seen in the forest, the ones with the weird carvings. Could those be the spirit stones? My reflection in the window caught my eye. My skin was getting pale, and my eyes, they were starting to look cloudy, like frosted glass. I had to hurry. The drive to the rock formations felt like forever. The hunger kept getting worse. Every time I saw a deer or rabbit in the woods, my mouth would water, and I'd think about raw meat. The cut on my arm was spreading, turning more of my skin that pale blue color. When I finally found the rocks, I noticed something strange. The snow didn't stick to them. They were completely bare, while everything around them was covered in white. I touched one of the stones, and it felt warm. The first warm thing I'd felt in days. That's when I heard the singing again, but not from my radio this time. It was coming from the woods, and this time, I could understand the words. They were calling to me, promising to make the hunger go away if I just gave in, just accepted what I was becoming. I grabbed one of the spirit stones and nearly dropped it. Pictures flooded my mind, like memories, but not mine. I saw the Wendigos as they used to be, hundreds of years ago. They were people once, trapped in a terrible winter. I saw the ceremony too, not just to cure the Wendigo curse, but to destroy them completely. Suddenly, I heard screams. Many of them. The Wendigos knew what I'd found. They were coming for me. My hands shook as I put the stone in my backpack and checked my rifle. The silver bullets might not kill them, but they could slow them down. I had to get back to my cabin. Had to figure out this ceremony before I completely changed. Because the hunger was getting stronger, and the Wendigo's voices in my head were getting harder to ignore. As I drove back, I saw them in my mirror, tall shadows moving through the trees, keeping pace with my truck easily. They weren't trying to catch me. Not yet. They were herding me somewhere. The sun was setting, and I was running out of time. Part of me was starting to think that maybe being a Wendigo wouldn't be so bad. Maybe being a hunter was better than being prey. I shook my head hard, trying to clear those thoughts away. I am still human. For now. But I don't know how much longer I can fight this hunger. Back at my cabin, I let Scout out of the bedroom. He sniffed me carefully before deciding I was still me enough to trust. I spread everything out on my desk, the spirit stone, my silver bullets, and the old letter about the ceremony. The letter said the ceremony had to be done at midnight when the moon was full. I looked out the window. The moon was almost full tonight. It would be completely full tomorrow. One more day. I had to hold on for one more day. But I needed those sacred herbs. The letter mentioned they grew in the place where the first winter came. I remembered something from my ranger training about an old valley where the first frost always appeared each year. Maybe that was it. I was planning my trip to the valley when I heard screaming from the direction of town. The Wendigos were hunting again. My hands shook as I loaded my rifle. Part of me, the human part, knew I had to try to help. But another part, the hungry part, hoped I'd find whatever the Wendigos were hunting. My mouth watered at the thought. No, I said out loud. I am not one of them yet. Scout and I got in the truck and drove toward the screams. The moon was rising, big and bright, making the snow glow silver. Through the trees I saw movement, dark shapes running fast, too fast. I found the first Wendigo in a clearing. It was hunched over something, and I could hear eating sounds. My stomach growled. The Wendigo turned its head, and for a moment we just stared at each other. Maybe it recognized what I was becoming. Then it smiled. Its face split open like cracking ice, showing rows of sharp teeth. "Brother," it whispered, "join us." I answered with my rifle. The silver bullet hit it right in the chest. It screamed and stumbled back, black blood smoking in the snow. But it didn't die. These things were too strong now, too well fed. More shapes emerged from the trees. 3, no, 4 more Wendigos. They were all different sizes. The biggest ones must have eaten the most. They moved in a circle around me, like wolves hunting. But they weren't trying to kill me. They were herding me towards something. I fired again and again, making them keep their distance. Each hit made them scream and back off, but they kept coming back. They knew I'd run out of bullets eventually. Then I saw where they were pushing me, toward the valley I'd been thinking about, the place where the sacred herbs might be. They'd been in my head, reading my thoughts. This was a trap, but it was also my only chance. I needed those herbs for the ceremony. And maybe, just maybe, there was something else in that valley. Something that could help me fight them. I made a choice. I pointed my truck toward the valley and hit the gas. The Wendigos howled behind me. Not angry howls, but happy ones. They thought they had me right where they wanted me. Maybe they did, but I still had some fight left in me. I looked at Scout sitting next to me, loyal even though he knew what I was becoming. I thought about Sarah, my wife, and how she never gave up fighting her cancer. I couldn't give up either. The valley was about 10 miles away. As I drove, I could see the Wendigos keeping pace through the trees. More were joining them. 6 now. 7. 8. The biggest hunting party yet. The cut on my arm was spreading faster now. The blue color creeping up toward my shoulder. The hunger was getting worse, too. I could smell things I shouldn't be able to smell. Animals in their dens, blood on the snow from miles away. But I held on to one thought. Midnight tomorrow. The full moon. The ceremony. I just had to survive until then. Just had to stay human until then. The Wendigos' screams filled the night air. They sounded like laughter now. They thought this hunt was already over. But they didn't know everything about me. They didn't know what I learned in Vietnam about setting traps. They didn't know about the extra silver bullets I'd hidden in the valley last summer, just in case I ever needed them. And they didn't know that sometimes the best way to spring a trap is to walk right into it. The valley was just ahead, dark and deep. The Wendigos thought they were hunting me, but I was hunting them too. The valley was exactly how I remembered it from last summer. A deep cut in the earth with steep walls and old trees. Perfect for a trap. Perfect for a last stand. I parked my truck at the valley entrance and grabbed my backpack. Inside was the spirit stone, some rope, and a map showing where I'd hidden the extra silver bullets. Scout stayed close to my side as we walked deeper into the valley. The Wendigos were being quiet now. Too quiet. They were trying to make me nervous, but I'd learned this trick in Vietnam. The scariest moment in a fight isn't when your enemy is screaming, it's when they go silent. My arm was almost completely blue now, and the hunger was so bad I could barely think straight. But I had to focus. I found the first box of silver bullets right where I'd left it, hidden in a hollow tree. 20 more shots. Not much, but it would have to be enough. The moon was rising higher, almost full, almost midnight. I started setting up for the ceremony just like the letter described, spirit stone in the center, sacred herbs all around it. I'd found them growing in the valley, just like I hoped, and my silver bullets, blessed with the words John White Bear had written down. That's when I heard it, that cracking ice laugh. The Wendigos were done waiting. They came from all directions at once, 8 of them moving like shadows through the trees. The smallest one was twice as tall as me, the biggest. I tried not to look at it too much. Looking at it made my mind feel like it was breaking. "Last chance, brother," the nearest one said. Its voice sounded like winter wind. "Join us willingly. The hunger only hurts if you fight it." I answered by shooting it in the face with a silver bullet. Everything happened fast after that. The Wendigos charged. I fired and fired, each blessed bullet making them scream and bleed that smoking black blood. But they kept coming. There were too many. I ran to my first trap, a rope tied between 2 trees. When the Wendigos chased me, they tripped on it, falling into a pile of blessed silver bullets I'd scattered on the ground. More screams. More black blood. But I was running out of bullets, running out of tricks, and running out of time. I could feel the hunger taking over. My teeth felt sharper. My fingers were getting longer. The Wendigo inside me was winning. That's when Scout did something amazing. He ran to the spirit stone and started barking at it. The stone began to glow with a warm light. Of course, the letter had said the ceremony needed a pure spirit to work. What spirit was purer than a loyal dog? I fought my way to the stone, using my last bullets to keep the Wendigos back. The biggest one, their leader, finally stepped into the light. It was huge, with antlers made of ice and eyes like red moons. When it spoke, its voice was like an avalanche. "You can't fight what you are becoming," it said. "The hunger always wins." "No," I said, fighting through the pain as my bones started to stretch and change. Sometimes hunger isn't the strongest thing. I thought about Sarah, about her smile, about Scout's loyalty, about all the people in town who needed protection. The Wendigo inside me screamed, but I forced it down. I grabbed the spirit stone with my good hand. Scout put his paw on it too. The stone's warmth spread through me, fighting the Wendigo's ice. The letter had said the ceremony needed one more thing, a sacrifice. Something precious freely given. I knew what I had to do. "Scout," I whispered. "Run." My brave, smart dog looked at me one last time, then ran for safety. With my last human strength, I lifted my rifle, loaded with my final silver bullet, and pointed it at my infected arm. The Wendigos realized what I was doing too late. The spirit stone was glowing brighter now, burning away their shadows. Their leader reached for me with claws like icicles. I pulled the trigger. The bullet hit my infected arm just as the full moon reached its peak. Light exploded from the spirit stone, bright as 1,000 suns. The Wendigos screamed, not their hunting screams, but sounds of real fear. The light burned through them like fire through ice. One by one, they shattered, breaking apart into piles of snow that melted away in the stone's warm light. Their leader was the last to go, those red eyes finally showing something other than hunger, showing defeat. When it was over, I was alone in the valley. My infected arm was gone, the price I'd paid to stay human. But the hunger was gone too. The night was quiet again, but normal quiet, natural quiet. Scout came back and led me to my truck. Somehow, he managed to guide me all the way back to my cabin, even with me barely conscious. I reported the missing hikers as lost to a storm. No one would believe the truth anyway. I transferred to a new job after that, a ranger station in Arizona. Somewhere warm. Somewhere without snow. But I left copies of John Whitebear's letter in 3 different places, just in case those things ever come back. Just in case another ranger notices strange footprints in the snow, or hears singing that sounds like cracking ice. Because sometimes the hunger doesn't win. Sometimes being human, having things you love, things you'll fight for, that's stronger than any monster, even on the coldest nights. My name is Marcus Johnson, and I've spent my whole life in the Okefenokee Swamp. It's a place where the water stretches as far as you can see, where ancient cypress trees grow tall with their knobby knees sticking out of the dark water, and where stories passed down through generations still whisper in the wind. I am a park ranger here now, just like my daddy was, and his daddy before him. We've always been swamp people. It's in our blood. But lately, something's different about these waters I've known, since I was just a kid learning to paddle my first boat. You see, we're in the middle of the worst drought anyone can remember. The water levels are so low that old Native American burial mounds are showing up where there used to be nothing but water. Places that were deep enough to swallow a house are now barely deep enough to float a canoe. And that's when the strange things started happening. I guess I should tell you about my father too. 10 years ago, he went out on a routine patrol and never came back. They searched for weeks, but found nothing. Not his boat, not his gear, not even his lucky hat that he'd worn every single day for 20 years. It broke something in me, losing him like that. I started drinking too much, trying to forget the way the swamp had swallowed him whole. But I've been sober for 8 months now. I wear his old charm necklace, a gift from a local medicine woman to my grandfather, and carry his badge in my pocket. It's my way of keeping him close while I try to make things right. Last week, though, everything changed. I was doing my morning patrol, checking on some of our regular fishing spots, when I saw something that made my blood run cold. There in the mud near Taylor's Creek was a footprint, but not like anything I'd ever seen before. It looked almost like an alligator track, except alligators don't walk on 2 legs. And they sure don't leave prints bigger than my whole boat. I radioed it in to the station, trying to keep my voice steady. Base, this is Marcus. You might want to see this. But by the time my colleague Sarah arrived with her camera, the water had risen just enough to cover the print, even though there hadn't been a drop of rain. That was just the beginning. The next day, old Bill Tucker, who's been fishing these waters longer than I've been alive, came to my office shaking like a leaf. His hands trembled as he poured himself a cup of coffee, spilling half of it on my desk. "Marcus," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "something tried to pull my boat under this morning, near the old cypress grove." He took a sip of coffee, his eyes far away. Wasn't no gator, wasn't no snag neither. It was like the water itself had hands. I wanted to tell him he was imagining things, that the heat and the drought were playing tricks on his mind. But then I remembered those tracks and the way the water had risen to hide them. And I remembered something else too, something from my father's old journals that I'd found in our attic last month. Something about lights in the swamp that moved against the wind and water that flowed the wrong way. The sun was setting as Bill left my office, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. That's when I saw it for the first time, a green light, glowing deep beneath the surface of the water near my dock. It moved like it had a mind of its own, weaving between the cypress knees, getting brighter and brighter until the whole channel lit up like it was full of stars. I grabbed my father's charm necklace without thinking, squeezing it tight. The light disappeared the moment my fingers touched the worn wooden beads, but I could have sworn I heard something, a sound like a sigh, or maybe a laugh, echoing across the water. That night, I couldn't sleep. I pulled out my father's old journals and started reading them properly for the first time. What I found in those pages would change everything I thought I knew about the Okefenokee, about my family's history here, and about what really happened to my father that day 10 years ago. Something ancient was waking up in the swamp. something that had been sleeping in the deep waters for centuries. And now, with the drought pulling back the waters like a curtain, it was starting to stir. I spent that whole night reading my father's journals. My eyes were burning, but I couldn't stop. Page after page was filled with things that made my skin crawl. He'd been tracking disappearances in the swamp, not just recent ones, but going back hundreds of years. Every single one happened during a drought, and every single one was near the deep channel we locals call the Devil's Cut. The next morning, I drove out to see Miss Ruby, the oldest person in our town. Her family has lived here even longer than mine, and she knows all the old stories. I found her on her porch, rocking in her chair like she was waiting for me. "I've been expecting you, Marcus," she said, her eyes sharp despite her age. "You've seen it, haven't you, the lights in the water?" My throat went dry. "Yes, ma'am." "Last night." She nodded slowly. "Your daddy saw them too, before he went missing. So did my grandfather, back in 1924. He was the only one who made it back from his fishing group that day." She leaned forward in her chair. "The native people who lived here first, they knew about it. Called it the water demon. Said it sleeps in the deep parts until the water gets low enough to wake it up." I pulled out my father's journal and showed her some of his notes. Her hand shook as she looked at the dates he'd written down. "Every 30 to 40 years, she whispered. "Always during the worst droughts. Always taking people who are alone on the water." She handed the journal back to me. "Your daddy wasn't crazy, Marcus. He was getting close to the truth." That afternoon, I went to the county library. The librarian helped me find old newspapers on microfilm, and there they were, the stories that matched everything in Dad's journal. A fishing party vanishing in 1924. 3 hunters gone without a trace in 1885. A family's boat found empty in 1957. But it was a photo from 1924 that made my heart stop. It was grainy and old, but you could clearly see something in the water behind a man's boat. Something big, something that looked almost human-shaped, but wrong somehow. The caption said the photo was taken just 2 days before that boat was found drifting empty in the Devil's Cut. I was making copies of everything when my radio crackled to life. "Marcus, you there?" It was Sarah, and she sounded scared. "We just got a call. 2 teenagers are missing near the old burial mounds. Their canoe washed up, but here is no sign of them." My hands were trembling as I gathered up my papers. As I rushed to my truck, I could have sworn I heard Miss Ruby's voice in my head. "It's waking up again, Marcus, and it's hungry after sleeping so long." I met Sarah and 2 other rangers at the boat launch. The sun was starting to set, painting everything in deep orange and long shadows. We split up to cover more ground, but I made sure everyone had a radio and one of the charm necklaces Miss Ruby had given me before I left her house. "Remember," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "stay in pairs and keep your radios on. These kids have to be our priority." I didn't mention what I'd learned about the thing in the water. They'd think I was crazy. I took my boat down toward the burial mounds, where the kids' canoe had been found. The water was so low that ancient cypress stumps stuck out everywhere like broken teeth. My spotlight showed nothing but dark water and tangled branches. That's when I heard it, a cry for help, somewhere in the darkness ahead. "Hello?" I called out, swinging my light toward the sound. "This is Ranger Johnson. Keep calling out." The voice came again, closer this time. It sounded like a teenage boy, scared and tired. I guided my boat carefully between the cypress knees, following the sound. But something felt wrong. The water around my boat started to move in the wrong direction, swirling like someone had pulled a plug from the bottom of the swamp. My radio crackled. "Marcus?" It was Sarah. "We found them. The kids are over here by Turner's Point. They managed to swim to high ground." My blood ran cold. If the kids were with Sarah, then whose voice was I hearing? I turned my boat around, but the engine suddenly died. The water was moving faster now, spinning my boat in circles. My spotlight caught something in the water, something big and dark, moving under the surface. It looked almost human-shaped, but too tall, too wrong. I grabbed my father's charm necklace, just as a huge wave of water rose up beside my boat. In the beam of my fallen spotlight, I saw it clearly for the first time. It was like a person made of dark water and scales, twice as tall as me, with eyes that glowed like the strange lights I'd seen the night before. The thing reached for my boat with arms that seemed to be made of flowing water. I held up the charm necklace, and the creature hesitated. The wooden bead started to grow warm in my hand, and I heard a sound like steam hissing. The water arms pulled back, and the thing sank beneath the surface. My engine suddenly roared back to life. I didn't wait around. I gunned it straight back to the boat launch, my heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. Later that night, after the kids were safely home and I'd filed a report that left out the impossible things I'd seen, I sat in my kitchen looking at my father's journal. On the last page he'd written in, there was a sketch of exactly what I'd seen, a tall humanoid figure made of water and scales. Under it he'd written, "It's not just taking people, it's learning from them, growing stronger, and it knows who I am." My phone rang, making me jump. It was Miss Ruby. "You saw it, didn't you?" she asked without saying hello. "Yes," I whispered. It tried to trick me, used a voice calling for help. "It's getting smarter," she said. "Your daddy's charm protected you tonight, but it won't work forever. The thing in the water, it remembers, and now it knows you are your father's son." I spent the next week mapping everything out on my kitchen wall. Every disappearance, every sighting, every strange light. I used different colored pins and string, just like they do in police shows. Red for disappearances, blue for lights, yellow for weird water movement. A pattern started to show up. Everything was happening in a circle around the deepest part of the swamp, the place we call the Devil's Cut. But something else was happening too. The water in people's wells was turning strange colors. Fish were washing up dead, their scales twisted in weird ways. And birds, thousands of them, were flying away from the swamp like they knew something bad was coming. I took water samples from different spots and brought them to my friend Tom at the university lab. When he looked at them under his microscope, he just shook his head. "Marcus, this isn't possible," he said, letting me look through the microscope. "The water molecules, they're moving wrong, like they're alive somehow. I've never seen anything like it." That night, I went back to the spot where I'd seen the creature. The water was even lower now, and the mud showed something I hadn't noticed before, a path of sorts, leading down into the deeper water. I followed it in my boat, using my depth finder to map the bottom. That's when I found it, an underwater cave system that wasn't on any of our maps. The entrance was usually too deep to see, but with the drought, it was just barely visible. The water around it was different too, darker, thicker somehow. When I dipped my hand in, it felt cold in a way that went straight to my bones. My depth finder started showing something strange, movement in the cave, something big. And then I saw them, bits of cloth, pieces of old boats, even a watch that looked just like the one my father used to wear, all tangled in the roots near the cave entrance. I reached for the watch with shaking hands. The glass was cracked, but I could still see the inscription on the back. To John Johnson, 25 years of service. My father's retirement watch. The one he was wearing the day he disappeared. Suddenly, my boat rocked hard. Something was moving under the surface, something huge. The water started bubbling, and a smell like rotting plants filled the air. I started my engine, but before I could move, I heard something that made my heart stop. My father's voice, coming from the water. "Marcus? Son? Is that you? Help me. I am trapped down here." I gripped my charm necklace tight, remembering how the creature had tried to trick me before. "You are not my father," I said, my voice shaking. "My father's gone." The voice changed then, turning into something that wasn't human at all, a deep, gurgling sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The water around my boat started to swirl, and in the fading light, I saw hundreds of small glowing eyes opening under the surface. I gunned the engine and didn't look back, but I knew something now that made my blood run cold. The creature wasn't just living in the cave. It was building something down there. And whatever it was using pieces of everything and everyone it had taken over the years. My hands were trembling as I gathered up my papers. As I rushed to my truck, I could have sworn I heard Miss Ruby's voice in my head. "It's waking up again, Marcus, and it's hungry after sleeping so long." I met Sarah and 2 other rangers at the boat launch. The sun was starting to set, painting everything in deep orange and long shadows. We split up to cover more ground, but I made sure everyone had a radio and one of the charm necklaces Miss Ruby had given me before I left her house. "Remember," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "stay in pairs and keep your radios on. These kids have to be our priority." I didn't mention what I'd learned about the thing in the water. They'd think I was crazy. I took my boat down toward the burial mounds, where the kids' canoe had been found. The water was so low that ancient cypress stumps stuck out everywhere like broken teeth. My spotlight showed nothing but dark water and tangled branches. That's when I heard it, a cry for help, somewhere in the darkness ahead. "Hello?" I called out, swinging my light toward the sound. "This is Ranger Johnson. Keep calling out." The voice came again, closer this time. It sounded like a teenage boy, scared and tired. I guided my boat carefully between the cypress knees, following the sound. But something felt wrong. The water around my boat started to move in the wrong direction, swirling like someone had pulled a plug from the bottom of the swamp. My radio crackled. "Marcus?" It was Sarah. "We found them. The kids are over here by Turner's Point. They managed to swim to high ground." My blood ran cold. If the kids were with Sarah, then whose voice was I hearing? I turned my boat around, but the engine suddenly died. The water was moving faster now, spinning my boat in circles. My spotlight caught something in the water, something big and dark, moving under the surface. It looked almost human-shaped, but too tall, too wrong. I grabbed my father's charm necklace, just as a huge wave of water rose up beside my boat. In the beam of my fallen spotlight, I saw it clearly for the first time. It was like a person made of dark water and scales, twice as tall as me, with eyes that glowed like the strange lights I'd seen the night before. The thing reached for my boat with arms that seemed to be made of flowing water. I held up the charm necklace, and the creature hesitated. The wooden bead started to grow warm in my hand, and I heard a sound like steam hissing. The water arms pulled back, and the thing sank beneath the surface. My engine suddenly roared back to life. I didn't wait around. I gunned it straight back to the boat launch, my heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. Later that night, after the kids were safely home and I'd filed a report that left out the impossible things I'd seen, I sat in my kitchen looking at my father's journal. On the last page he'd written in, there was a sketch of exactly what I'd seen, a tall humanoid figure made of water and scales. Under it he'd written, "It's not just taking people, it's learning from them, growing stronger, and it knows who I am." My phone rang, making me jump. It was Miss Ruby. "You saw it, didn't you?" she asked without saying hello. "Yes," I whispered. It tried to trick me, used a voice calling for help. "It's getting smarter," she said. "Your daddy's charm protected you tonight, but it won't work forever. The thing in the water, it remembers, and now it knows you are your father's son." I spent the next week mapping everything out on my kitchen wall. Every disappearance, every sighting, every strange light. I used different colored pins and string, just like they do in police shows. Red for disappearances, blue for lights, yellow for weird water movement. A pattern started to show up. Everything was happening in a circle around the deepest part of the swamp, the place we call the Devil's Cut. But something else was happening too. The water in people's wells was turning strange colors. Fish were washing up dead, their scales twisted in weird ways. And birds, thousands of them, were flying away from the swamp like they knew something bad was coming. I took water samples from different spots and brought them to my friend Tom at the university lab. When he looked at them under his microscope, he just shook his head. "Marcus, this isn't possible," he said, letting me look through the microscope. "The water molecules, they're moving wrong, like they're alive somehow. I've never seen anything like it." That night, I went back to the spot where I'd seen the creature. The water was even lower now, and the mud showed something I hadn't noticed before, a path of sorts, leading down into the deeper water. I followed it in my boat, using my depth finder to map the bottom. That's when I found it, an underwater cave system that wasn't on any of our maps. The entrance was usually too deep to see, but with the drought, it was just barely visible. The water around it was different too, darker, thicker somehow. When I dipped my hand in, it felt cold in a way that went straight to my bones. My depth finder started showing something strange, movement in the cave, something big. And then I saw them, bits of cloth, pieces of old boats, even a watch that looked just like the one my father used to wear, all tangled in the roots near the cave entrance. I reached for the watch with shaking hands. The glass was cracked, but I could still see the inscription on the back. To John Johnson, 25 years of service. My father's retirement watch. The one he was wearing the day he disappeared. Suddenly, my boat rocked hard. Something was moving under the surface, something huge. The water started bubbling, and a smell like rotting plants filled the air. I started my engine, but before I could move, I heard something that made my heart stop. My father's voice, coming from the water. "Marcus? Son? Is that you? Help me. I am trapped down here." I gripped my charm necklace tight, remembering how the creature had tried to trick me before. "You are not my father," I said, my voice shaking. "My father's gone." The voice changed then, turning into something that wasn't human at all. A deep, gurgling sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The water around my boat started to swirl, and in the fading light, I saw hundreds of small glowing eyes opening under the surface. I gunned the engine and didn't look back, but I knew something now that made my blood run cold. The creature wasn't just living in the cave. It was building something down there. And whatever it was using pieces of everything and everyone it had taken over the years. We split up, just like we planned. Sarah and Tom took their boats to different spots around the Devil's Cut, making a triangle with my position. Each of us had salt lines ready and our charm necklaces on. At first, nothing happened. The swamp was quieter than I'd ever heard it. No frogs croaking, no insects buzzing, like every living thing was holding its breath. Then the water started moving, not in waves or ripples, but like it was alive. It rose up in the middle of our triangle, forming a shape taller than the cypress trees. I saw those glowing eyes again, hundreds of them now, and a mouth that looked like a whirlpool. "Now!" I yelled. Sarah and Tom threw their salt lines into the water while I started the ancient binding words Miss Ruby had taught me. The creature screamed, a sound like rushing water and breaking trees all mixed together. It tried to sink back into the deep water, but our salt lines had it trapped in the shallows. It started splitting apart, trying to escape as smaller versions of itself, just like my father's journal had warned. But we were ready. Every time a piece of it tried to break away, one of us would throw more salt, forcing it back. The creature got desperate. It started showing us things, making shapes in the water of people we'd lost. I saw my father reaching for me, looking just like he did the day he disappeared. Sarah saw her brother who'd drowned when she was little. Tom saw his wife who'd passed away last year. "Don't look at them." Miss Ruby's voice came strong over our radios. "They're not real." The creature gathered itself up one last time, rising like a wall of dark water in front of my boat. Those hundreds of eyes stared right at me, and I heard its voice in my head. "You are just like your father. He thought he could stop me too. Would you like to see his last moments?" That's when I knew what Miss Ruby meant about the watch. I held up my father's old pocket watch in one hand and my charm necklace in the other. The watch started glowing, not like a flashlight, but like it had starlight trapped inside. "My father knew what you were," I said. "He left us clues, and he left us a way to stop you." I threw the watch straight at the creature's center. There was a flash of light so bright it turned night into day for a second. The creature's scream shook the trees. I felt something snap, like a rubber band breaking, and suddenly all the memories it had stolen came rushing out. I saw everything, every person it had taken, every life it had ended, and I saw my father's last moments. He hadn't died afraid. He died fighting, using his own life to bind the creature to the depths. But the drought had weakened those bonds. The water fell back down, but differently now. The darkness was gone from it. The creature's eyes winked out one by one, like stars going out at dawn. Where it had been, the water now looked clean and normal, just regular swamp water, moving the way it should. The sun started coming up. In the early morning light, I saw something floating in the water, my father's charm necklace, the one he'd been wearing when he disappeared. As I picked it up, I realized something. The swamp felt different now. Lighter somehow, like a shadow we'd all been living under, was finally gone. Sarah and Tom pulled their boats up next to mine. We were all soaking wet and shaking, but alive. My radio crackled one last time. Miss Ruby's voice came through, sounding tired but happy. "Your daddy would be proud, Marcus. The swamp is ours again. And this time, it'll stay that way." That was 2 months ago. The drought finally broke last week, and the swamp waters are back to their normal levels. The fish have returned, and so have the birds. At night, you can hear the frogs singing again, like they're making up for lost time. I still work as a ranger, but things are different now. Every morning when I go out on patrol, I wear both charm necklaces, mine and my father's. Not because I am scared anymore, but to remember. Sarah and Tom kept theirs too. Sometimes we talk about that night, just to make sure we know it really happened. Miss Ruby says the creature is gone for good this time. The binding my father started, and I finished, made sure of that. She told me that's why it had been so focused on me. It knew I might be able to finish what my father began. They never found my father's body, or any of the others the creature took. But sometimes, on quiet mornings when the mist rises off the water, I think I can feel him out there. Not trapped anymore, but free, part of the swamp he loved so much. I put up a small marker for him near the boat launch. Nothing fancy, just a wooden cross with his name, and the words, "He protected these waters." Every now and then, I find flowers there that I didn't leave. Seems like other folks remember him too. The other day, a young ranger asked me if I ever get scared out on the water anymore. I told her the truth, that the swamp is like any wild place. It has its dangers, sure, but it has its protectors too. Some you can see, like us rangers, and some you can't. I still keep my father's journal in my desk drawer. Sometimes I read through it, but not because I am looking for monsters anymore. I read it to remember how brave he was, and how he never gave up trying to keep people safe. The Devil's Cut is just another fishing spot now. The water there runs clear and clean. But on some evenings, when the sun hits the cypress trees just right, and the shadows stretch long across the water, I pause there in my boat. I touch both charm necklaces, say a quiet thank you to my father, and remember that every place has its secrets, and some secrets are better left to rest in the deep water, where they belong.